Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the burden of proof and how to figure out whether or not you're the one who has it. Now, a lot of times when you're making arguments, you may hear somebody talking about the burden of proof. So what does that actually mean? Well, basically the burden of proof means that you are responsible for providing the evidence to support a particular argument or a particular claim. You are the one who has to give evidence for the thing that you're saying. Not everybody necessarily has the burden of proof in all debates. And so that's one of the things you want to be aware of, whether or not you are the one responsible for providing evidence. Basically, it's fairly straightforward in most cases. If you are making a positive claim that requires evidence to substantiate it, then you have the burden of proof. What do I mean by a positive claim? By positive claim, essentially what I mean is that you are making a specific argument. You are trying to prove something to the person that you are arguing with or whatever it is. So if, for instance, I were to make a claim like this poem reflects challenges, or this poem uses the imagery of the African American women's hairstyles to reflect on internalized racism. Okay, that's a bit of an argument that I recently made in a paper I published. I then bear the burden of proof for that. I have to provide evidence to show that this particular symbol within this particular poem reflects the thing that I'm saying it's reflecting. I'm making an argument about a thing in the world. I'm making an argument about the condition of the thing. I then have to provide evidence to prove that. The burden of proof is on me. Sometimes people will try to rather slipperily, that's not really a word, sometimes people will try in bad faith to avoid the burden of proof by trying to reverse the argument onto you when you are not making a positive claim. I had this happen to me recently in a debate on Facebook. There's someone who made the claim that 99.99% of people are centrists rather than conservatives or liberals. I would also throw in leftists as another option, but whatever. There's other potential political positions as well. But this person made the argument that 99.99% of people are centrists rather than liberals or conservatives. I said, I'm not sure that that's true. Can you provide any evidence to support that claim? And can you define what you mean by centrist? Now, these are reasonable questions in the context of the argument that this person was making. At some point in this debate, he basically just refused to take seriously the questions I was asking. But at some point in this debate, he tried to reverse the burden of proof and put it onto me by saying, you notice how I didn't ask you to provide any evidence that more than 0.01% of people are not centrists. In this debate, I was not the one who bears the burden of proof because I was not putting forward a positive claim. I was raising questions about the positive claim that he had put forward. Because he had made that claim that 99.99% of people are centrists, he was the one responsible for proving that claim. I can legitimately raise questions about it, especially since he provided no evidence for it. I can legitimately raise questions and raise doubts about that position without myself being required to provide counter evidence. So this is the thing with burden of proof. The burden of proof, having someone be skeptical or having someone challenge your position does not alleviate you of the burden of proof if you have made a positive claim. We also actually see the same thing. This is going to get a little bit controversial here, but I watch a lot of atheist YouTube. I find the arguments really fascinating. This is a thing that we see often with Christian apologists. This idea of trying to reverse the burden of proof, where Christian apologists will say atheists positively assert that there is no God, therefore they must provide evidence that there is no God. That's not necessarily the case. There are atheists who do positively assert that there is no God, but there's also atheists who say, I simply don't believe it, which is not the same as... That's an epistemological statement, a question of knowledge and belief, rather than an ontological statement saying this is objectively the truth. But the thing is, to say that essentially the implicit argument of the apologists at that stage is, unless the other side can provide concrete evidence that there is no God, we should accept the premise that there is a God. This does not really work. And so this is kind of the other thing with the burden of proof, is if you can't assume something to be true in order to alleviate the burden of proof, right? Because if you make a statement like, there is a God, that is a positive claim that requires evidence. You cannot then sort of turn that and say, unless you can prove me wrong, I must be right. Because the positive claim requires evidence. And a lack of evidence against it is not actually evidence for that position. So, in this case, the attempt to reverse the burden of proof, first off, is not necessarily reliable, because it's simply not a question of without a credible, evidenced counter argument, my argument must be correct. But you also then try and prove your argument by assuming that your argument is correct, which is logically unsupportable. So this is the thing. Again, if you are making a positive claim, I assert that this thing is true, then you need to provide evidence to support that. People who question that claim do not necessarily need to provide counter evidence. So this is the thing with the burden of proof. The other thing that people will sometimes try and do is a kind of Occam's razor approach to the burden of proof. And this is another way of sort of getting out of... In some cases, sometimes I'm a big fan of Occam's razor, actually, which is, generally speaking, the principle that when faced with competing propositions, the one that requires the fewest assumptions is most likely to be correct. I'm generally a big fan of Occam's razor. I think it applies in most situations. Sometimes, though, people will try and use an Occam's razor approach to escape the burden of proof. And that can work, but it can also be a logical fallacy, particularly when it depends on something like the either-or fallacy. So I love it's now no longer a current program, but there was a program called the Naked Archaeologist with Simca Jacovici. And it was an archaeology program. He went around biblical archaeology primarily. There's a particular claim made by one of the archaeologists that he interviews. They are trying to date a particular site. They're looking at pottery. It's 10th century. Pottery typology is a big thing in archaeology. If you don't know, because the style of pottery changes fairly quickly. But he says, we know from the pottery typology that this is a 10th century site. It could be David or it could be Solomon. The Bible tells me that it's King David, or the Bible tells me, the Bible tells me that it's King Solomon. We can't tell the difference between Solomon and David's pottery because they're too close. I say it's Solomon. If you want to claim that it's David, the burden of proof is on you and not me. The problem with this is that it assumes that these are the only two options. It assumes that biblical history is generally reliable, that someone named David existed and was a king of Israel, that someone named Solomon existed and was a king of Israel. And it assumes that these are the only two potential people who could have built this site with 10th century pottery. 10th century BCE, by the way. Yeah, you can use the Bible as evidence to suggest that this would be a Solomonic site. Whether or not people are willing to accept that as legitimate enough evidence to prove it is an open question. But just to say, this is the default, and if you want to prove that it's something else, you have to prove that, and I don't have to prove my position, is rather problematic. So this is the thing. Again, you want to be aware of whether or not you are the one responsible for providing the evidence to support your claims. And if you are, then you want to make sure that you are providing reasonable, responsible evidence to actually support your arguments. Generally, again, the easiest way to determine this is, are you making a positive claim? That is, are you stating that something is true? If so, generally you bear the burden of proof then.